All right, in today's episode, we're going to be going over the space shuttle program and why it ultimately failed. But before we go into why the space shuttle program failed, we must first understand what it was in the first place. The space shuttle was America's first partially reusable rocket developed in the 70s right after the Apollo program. Only 6 space shuttles were ever built, 5 flown in space, while 1 was just a prototype. The Columbia Space Shuttle was in service from 1981 to 2003, and it was the first space shuttle to ever reach orbit. The Challenger was in service from 1983 to 1986. The Discovery was in service from 1984 to 2011, while the Atlantis was in service from 1985 to 2011, with the Endeavour being built in 1992 before it eventually retired in 2011. The Endeavour was the final space shuttle to ever be built. There was another space shuttle called the Enterprise, but this one was just a prototype and never went to orbit. Alright, now let's talk about some of the things that the space shuttle program promised originally in the 70s. So originally, it promised for a 2 to 4 week turnaround, which means that a space shuttle would take off, and after it landed, it would have 2 to 4 weeks again before it flew again. And it also promised 50 total space shuttle flights a year. Now, let's go over the turnaround rates and averages throughout the space shuttle program history. The turnaround rate is from once the space shuttle lands to when it takes off again. So in the 80s, it was averaged around 6 months, and in the 90s, it was 4 months. The early 2000s, it was 3 to 4 months, which is the best it ever got. And after the Columbia disaster in 2003, it was around 6 to 9 months per shuttle. And in the 2010s, it was the highest at 1 year average. From 1981 to 1986, the space shuttle program averaged 5 flights a year, with 1985 being the busiest year ever in the space shuttle program history, with 9 total flights in 1985. This is when the space shuttle started to become more routine and safe. NASA has a more realistic goal now of doing 20 missions a year instead of that crazy 50 from earlier. And during this time, NASA flew 24 missions before eventually the Challenger disaster happened. So let's take a look at the 90s, because this is the height of the space shuttle program. So during the 90s, there were a total of 64 space shuttle missions in that decade, and that was an average of 6.4 missions a year. At most launches out of any decade in the history of the space shuttle program. That all was in the 90s, because 47% of all space shuttle missions, they happened in the 90s. Now let's talk about 2000 to 2003, right before the Columbia disaster took place. So from 2000 to 2003, there were a total of 17 missions with an average of 5.5 missions a year. After the Columbia disaster up until 2010, there were 20 more missions in that decade with an average of 4 missions a year. And the space shuttle fleet was now just 3 shuttles. So originally there was 5, and now there's 3. And because of this, there was more stricter, and NASA became less aggressive, and they weren't as risk-takey as they once were. And the shuttle in this time period was mainly focusing on the International Space Station instead of satellites, so the only reason the space shuttle was around in this time was for the International Space Station. Now let's talk about the 2010s. So the last 2 years that the space shuttle program was still active, there were 6 missions in the last 2 years with an average 3 missions a year. The final mission took place in 2011 in July. So why was the turnaround rate so low on the space shuttle? So first off, the solid rocket boosters that were used to get the space shuttle into orbit were reusable, but had to go through significant cleaning and even being rebuilt most of the time because they had to deal with salt water and all that good stuff. Also, the space shuttle had 24,000 heat tiles that protected the shuttle in re-entry, and each one had to be inspected and tested before another flight could take place. Also, the space shuttle was a very complex system that was just very slow overall. And while the space shuttle was reusable, it just wasn't very fast and efficient, not like the 2 to 4 weeks we were promised in the 70s. So, as time went on, the turnaround rate did get slower for the space shuttle, mainly because safety and inspection protocols after the 2 shuttle disasters, and also because aging hardware and replacement, because you gotta think, this is like 2010 now, this hardware is from the 70s. This spacecraft is from the 70s, and we're flying it 40 years later. It's like an old car. It's gonna break down eventually. It's gonna need to get its, alternator replaced. It's gonna have problems. Another reason for that is NASA they weren't really going to take the risk, because not like the Apollo days, NASA was always taking risk. But after the 2 space shuttle disasters, they were just a lot more careful and not a lot more go-getter. But another main reason besides the aging hardware about why it retired is the cost. The space shuttle on average cost $1.5 billion per launch, and it costs $60,000 to get 1 kilogram to low Earth orbit. Compare that to SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket, that only costs $2,500 to get a kilogram to orbit. That is significantly cheaper. So why would NASA keep operating this vehicle that's just old and costs so much money when there's newer technology? So let's just recap here. The original goal was 50 launches a year. The height was 9. But the realistic goal was 20. Only 45% of that goal was achieved. The original was 2 to 4 weeks for a shuttle turnaround, but that just got longer as time went on. And the fastest 2-day turnaround for a space shuttle was 54 days and 8 weeks. So they wanted 2 to 4 weeks, the fastest was 8. It's a big difference. One more thing to also add is that the space shuttle could only stay in orbit for 16 days, with the longest mission being 17. During the 30-year span that the space shuttle was in service, it did some amazing things, such as deploying the Hubble Space Telescope and building the International Space Station. While the space shuttle program did not live up to most of its expectations, it is still one of the most iconic time periods in American spaceflight history. Eventually, all good things do eventually come to an end, and from a financial perspective, it just didn't make much sense to keep operating the space shuttle, and it already achieved what it needed to, and because of that, it was retired sadly in 2011.